Coda 7, Part 2. As featured in the map is indestructible. Starting with Section 4. Julia Kristeva speaks of discourse, and we might view discourses themselves as isomorphic with the C word. They seek a consistency that leaves no opening. When we speak, we seek to finish the speaking. When we seek, we look to finish the seeking. We want a crystalline structure, quote unquote. How can we not? We might say, which means we want everything to add up and come together in a manner that suggests we were not mad or crazy to begin the effort in the first place. But there is something irrational about doing that which we don't finish. We only want to begin what doesn't prove a waste. And an internally consistent system is that which precisely doesn't make us feel like we wasted our time, while at the same time giving us the feeling that we are never finished with our understanding, and hence we have meaning and even belonging for a lifetime. The subjects of discourse are non-persons, Kristeva writes, which is to say we enter a discourse and become non-persons, in a sense that what is discussed, if that which all adds up, is not experienced as something which particularly requires us to add up. What adds up is experienced as discovered, not created, and it is critically that all internally consistents have this very feeling, as discussed in Belonging again, if they are to work on us in a manner that makes us feel added up and together. Every discourse, like every ideological system, runs into the problem of feeling beyond the people while at the same time feeling like something people participate in. No map will last which fails in this endeavor, and perhaps can't even be a map, just mere notion. The I must be involved and important, but not the isolated source. And where there is completeness, it is always plausible that the ideology is human-created. After all of its components can be known and understood by finite people, so it's possible that it was created by people, which creates space for enough doubt to undermine the whole ideological structure. This is why Gödel has changed things. We now have a way to make incompleteness part of every completeness, which means we are dealing with incompleteness with the I in parentheses, which always entails a space that is not fully knowable by humans, and thus that which is plausibly beyond any I to create. The incompleteness helps people overcome the authority problem and authority circle discussed in Belonging Again Part 1, an ontological method which can be theoretically employed in any discourse, making them, say, dialogos or circling, alluding to Vervaeke and Guy Sinstock, or any worldview, making them maps. Gödel has given us much, but problematically, though maps can help us deal with authority problems and issues of exhausting possibility, and humans perish without possibility, as William Desmond teaches on. Gödel has not given us what we need to make the maps relate. They are currently isolated, locked within and apart, and drifting in themselves. Beauty is needed to cut to the chase, and as Jockin teaches on, but that will be discussed in The Fate of Beauty. To be clear, completeness is not necessarily bad, as if fragmentation were good. There is nobility in efforts for completeness in discourse, thinking, and the like. The issue is that an effort for completeness is ultimately an effort for self-effacement if it doesn't incorporate essential acts somewhere, which is, from another angle, an essential opening, incomplete with the I in parentheses. But this begs the question of how we might genuinely seek the incomplete with the I in parentheses, and not let this effort become a subtle and self-deceptive effort for completeness by another name. If this mistake is made even in the C word, what can be done? We are always already naturally dispositioned for some crystallization of internal consistency, and no matter how genuinely we seek to avoid this problem, our minds will likely calculate this effort and trick us into contributing to the mistake if we try to avoid as we avoid it. What hope is there? Well, this is why we require faithful presence and the surprise of the other. Otherwise, it's only a matter of time before we slip back into a self-effacing AA, that we might call AB even. We need the face of Levinas in counterology, as steward in faithful presence, prepared for instead of planned, illic, habituated for via critical thinking, when alienatingly empathetic, a way of living that the map can block and hide. All of this will be a key focus of reconstructing A as A, which merges with belonging again. For now, let us continue to approach finishing Volume 2 of The Truism, the Rational, acknowledging the problem that blurs require and some kneels or leaps. Section 5. To review and draw thoughts from Incompleteness by Rebecca Goldstein. Though they didn't like each other, both Ludwig Wittgenstein and Kurt Gödel contributed to ending the quest for pure objectivity and for replacing humanity back in the center of the universe. Their thinking was much more similar than either perhaps realized or wanted to admit. Wittgenstein showed that we cannot speak the unspeakable truths, but they exist, while Gödel proved that our mathematical knowledge exceeds our systems. What constitutes the whole of reality must necessarily exceed the limits of any system, worldview, science, ideology, so on, that humans come up with. And this being the case, though some systems can better correspond, no system can be practically identical with the correspondence, or at least if one was, we couldn't know it. Furthermore, since systems cannot be complete, systems cannot provide an objectivity to people about which system, with the S in parentheses, people should choose to live according to, nor can systems operate independent of human involvement. Lastly, systems cannot self-justify themselves and are notably vulnerable to corruption, as Goldstein writes. Just as no proof of the consistency of a formal system can be accomplished within the system itself, so, too, no validation of our rationality, of our very sanity, can be accomplished using our rationality itself. If your entire system becomes infected with madness, including the very rules by which you reason, then how can you ever reason your way out of your madness? Thus, when it comes to knowing correspondence, the human element cannot be removed. We are stuck in the center of the world, figuring out what makes it turn, even if we rather have the world show us. Yet, imperative to grasp the essential incompleteness of ideologies becomes part of their completeness. The fact Christians cannot observe God is part of what axiomatically defines God. The fact that the scientific method can only be applied in certain contexts becomes acceptable in scientism. The fact libertarianism cannot point to an example of a nation that's markets were entirely free is proof that national governments don't get out of the way, as opposed to evidence that libertarianism rests its thinking on an ideal. All ideologies must necessarily be incomplete and incorporate idealistic reference points, axioms, and other premises that the ideological systems themselves cannot justify. But upon these truths, rationality erects internally consistent systems. It is important to note that what Gödel proved didn't deconstruct the possibility of internally consistent systems, only totally consistent systems, which deny essential incompleteness. Gödel showed that a system must be erected on axioms that cannot themselves be justified by the system erected on them. This doesn't mean the axioms are wrong, only that we cannot say for sure if they are right or wrong. For that would require stepping outside the system, which even if possible would require leaving behind the rationality necessary for determining if the axioms are right or wrong. So completeness is not possible as a totality, but an incomplete system is possible with the I in parentheses, and that possibility is far stronger in enabling greater and more refined map proliferations versus notion proliferation. What Gödel proved was that systems are at best internally consistent systems, and that it was impossible for any of them to be totally consistent, that a lack of total consistency was not evidence that the system was false. The longer an ideology has been around, the higher the likelihood it is indeed internally consistent. And in our pluralism today, I think it is safe to say that we are surrounded by many, if not countless, internally consistent ideologies, as testified by the C-word maps. And this leaves us having to deal with the problem of internally consistent systems, a problem Gödel has helped us see. Hegel's absolute itself is ultimately responsible. But this is not all bad. The problem invites life, for it invites us to be essentially involved. Still, it should be noted a world without imagination would lack works of arts, paintings, compositions, films, which would not be rationally justified, which would be tragic, but it might also be a world without C-words and psychotic entrapments, both of which we might associate also with the egors described by Patrick Ryan, but I'm not sure. A world where, say, there was one totalizing map would be a world with a lot less creativity, for only the justified creativity which that map made possible would manifest. But there would also be a lot less magical thinking and tribalism. A world where people only acted when rationally justified would be one in which people perhaps didn't act when driven by love, attracted by beauty, and so on. But it would also be a world where people were less manipulatable by gurus, in less need of intellectual self-defense, and so on. And so, a question, would the most rational of all possible worlds be best? I don't think so, but I think that means our world, for its non-rational possibilities, is potentially better or worse. We are not the most rational of all possible worlds, but for that we might be worse off or better. We must decide, and many experts seem to encourage us to choose determinism, which is to choose a world of the truth versus the absolute, as I have discussed with Coda. On materialism, Matthew Segal tells us that materialism poses a danger to our mental and ecological health because it attempts to make itself true. So it goes with the truth versus the absolute, any given map versus the territory. Anyway, as we discussed in Coda 6, facts become compelling as experiences, especially when we are all in sync, to allude to Robert Winthnone's book, asking about what could account for the stability of American religion. But so too lies, falsehoods, half-truths, C-words can be experienced. Anything that is coherent and consistent can be like actuality, and in its structure seem plausible, and can even be aesthetic and attractive. After all, as Tam Amakra points out in Phenomenology of Will, there is something fundamentally aesthetic about the unavoidable drive for coherence. Problematically, regardless if it's true or false, a worldview, opinion, C-word, truth, etc. can all share a similar coherent structure, and also all of them have the potential to be experienced and so compel us. But here's the kicker: actualities can be less likely to be compelling, precisely because they are more bound by actuality and how they can manifest. They have less creative options, we might say. Actuality simply can't use, be, say, do, etc. anything the actualities want to be more compelling. There is a range of resources, we might say, which actualities can employ and stay true to themselves. Falsities are much more malleable, though in their need to maintain consistency. Falsities can incorporate much more imagination. This isn't an unlimited imagination, no, for the imagination is bound to a need to maintain coherence, but there can be, say, 50 ways coherence can be maintained regarding X, while there is only one actual coherence for X, which is to say a coherence that is most like correspondence. But haven't we said this whole time that coherence isn't correspondence? How then can we tell the actual coherence from the 49 imagined coherences? Perhaps we can't. And that's the problem of internally consistent systems, suggesting the depths of our problem and why Pandora's rationality spreads. Can we stay faithfully present, facing this possible proliferation, a Ulysses with wax? How much in actuality can become coherent is limited, but how much a falsity, opinion, or the like can become coherent is far more unlimited. To help make the point, let us consider how actualities we directly experience in our common lives more easily bind our imaginations than stories we learn about online, suggesting our work on Hume and O.G. Ross. When I experience a cup on a table in my kitchen, I can imagine a number of explanations for how it got there, but I believe the number of imaginable possibilities is less than when we learn about a cup being put on a table in India online. In our house, we regularly see how cups move around, have a sense who was in the house and who wasn't, and so on, while the table and cup in India are entirely unknown to me, and maybe the image is just a deep fake. Now, again, even if I rationally construct the actual coherence regarding how the cup in my house ended up on my table, I can never with certainty know that my coherence actually corresponds. But regardless, the number of possible coherences I can imagine is still less, helping bind Pandora's rationality. Even if correspondence is denied to me, I can at least still operate and think according to a more limited range. A falsehood does not have to maintain actuality while exploring its options and resources for increasing how compelling it is, but in actuality does. Actuality is at a disadvantage. A falsehood that nevertheless maintains consistency is much more flexible and fluid than actuality, for all it must do is maintain its coherence, while an actuality must maintain both its coherence and correspondence, the second of which can't even be fully appreciated. This is a much harder task, and so actuality cannot easily shape itself to become more emotional, relevant, and so on, while false coherence can. Truth has far fewer tools in its toolbox to become compelling, while a falsity has far more, hence why Pandora's rationality can spread so quickly once it is unleashed. The weakness of a falsity or lie is realized in encountering someone with a good memory who can keep up with all the lies to see if any of them contradict. Hence, a reason why memory might have been so central to classic thought, as praised by thinkers like Augustine and Plato. Where memory is bad, Pandora's rationality will be harder to stop. There is likely more of an inverse relationship between actuality and how compelling something is, precisely because it's more likely that premise not bound by correspondence would achieve emotional advantages, because it can more easily access resources to this effect, because it doesn't have to maintain actuality, only plausibility, which a premise inherently does by maintaining coherence. This being the case, it would seem as if we in ourselves must learn how to see things as beautiful, for example, versus wait for things to be beautiful in themselves. We must be active cultivators of a capacity to experience beauty and attraction aligned with actuality. Otherwise, it is only probable that falsities will compel us more than not. The imagination breaks through the taken for granted reality of ordinary life, yes, but the imagination in Seaward is not the same as the imagination inspired to soar by a river hole, a lack in beauty. Otherwise, we seem fated to simply spin around in a map maze of our making, taken by a Derridian ever-deference or inscrutability of reference of Willard Quinn, which suggests no radical translation is possible, which is a translation in which nothing is lost, which is to say correspondence is there, but not for us, Kafka. There is no hope of quantitative defining or calculating our way to what is. We must hope for a qualitative, no-knowledge proof, strike of beauty. But if this cannot be calculated too, what hope is there of this glimpse? Is there just some waiting and some Heideggerian clearing? Yes, a faithful presence, Neil Ansom. Section 6. Benjamin Fontaine taught us that only the foolish can be free in non-rationality. But in the C word, we see a risk of using a label of foolishness to legitimize sinking into madness that feels like discovery and even fighting for justice. Autonomous rationality is a problem, but autonomous non-rationality could be a problem as well. And just because we are fools does not mean we are on the right path. But what does it mean to even speak of the right path in a world after Gödel? Is there only error? Maybe, but Hegel taught us not to fear error. Those who fall into C-word can face fears and feel like a Thomas More, standing up for what no one else is willing to be seen defending. And there are true C-words, meaning those brave individuals who could indeed be brave and right, who can say who doesn't investigate the C-word for themselves. But at that point, they will have taken the pitch and risk and easily find themselves unable to escape, ever sunk and pulled into the understanding of the world framed by the internally consistent system into which they venture, perhaps so motivated by a desire for intellectual and epistemic responsibility. Ethics easily leads them. How can we say they acted wrongly? Daily with Zizek tells us that subjectivity can only come into being as a passage through madness, as an ongoing attempt to impose a symbolic integrity against the ever-present threat of disintegration and negativity. The C word is like everyone, seeking shelter from disintegration, but perhaps the C word is more noble in choosing vulnerability to social rejection. Are those who aren't C words to be trusted if they say otherwise? Who wants to be possibly a coward? We are all under a map drive, a drive for coherence against the real. Perhaps the entire book, The Map is Indestructible, can be seen as a case. That drive naturally ends up in map drive, though must it? Question. The human condition is marked by an eternal and impossible attempt to bring about some sort of resolution to this drive, a paradoxical drive to resolve drive as such. In this way, drive becomes attached to certain objects of excess. C words are excessive, as are theories of everything, vast religions, grand systems. The map is always thanks to and seeking to fully articulate the territory which must exceed it, and yet this is an excess the map cannot too directly acknowledge or risk its authority. The map needs the territory, but it also needs to be careful not to relate to the territory too exactly or become useless. The map needs error. The error is a gift. Absoluteness, incompleteness. These and others can sanctify the error beyond rationality's reach to deconstruct, and thus map drive can ever drive. For good? not necessarily, or else it would not address us in courage. An extensive quote, but as Zizek has constantly stressed, the subject is neither a substantial entity nor a specific locus. Rather, the subject exists as an external dimension of resistance access towards all forms of subjectivation. The subject is a basic constitutive void that drives subjectation, but which cannot ultimately be filled out by it. It is simultaneously the lack of the leftover in all forms of subjectivation. This is why the Lacanian mark for the subject is a $sign, the barred empty subject. The subject cannot find its name in the symbolic order to achieve full ontological identity. We resist being subjects as we resist oppression, and yet we self-efface without being subjects, as Philip Reef understood. Our best hope is a subject alienation diversity. The subject is both the movement away from subjectivation and the very drive towards subjectivation as a way of escaping such a condition, which is to say we resist being alienated into subjecthood, and yet we also seek subjecthood to escape the anxiety of freedom found in not being subjects. We are contradictions, a paradoxical situation that naturally tries to understand itself according to an AA that leads to a loss of sanity, Korbisky. This sounds like a hopeless mess, but more hopefully, it is through this very resistance access towards subjectivation that human beings are essentially open to the possibility of developing new forms of subjectivation. In this way, the subject is both the transcendental condition of possibility and impossibility for all forms of contingent subjectivation. But this possibility is lost if our map drive, which plays a role in making ourselves possible, achieves totalization and so self-effacement, versus instead create the stage upon which beauty and otherness might strike us, thanks to and in incompleteness, which we can associate with the constructive excess of the real qua the unmasterable negativity upon which every positivization finally depends. Beauty judges, beauty pierces, beauty saves. The fate of beauty is the fate of us. Beauty, though, is it just another fantasy, another example of imputing the status of the real to a particular other in order to maintain the dream of holistic fulfillment? Well, perhaps. There couldn't be hope if there wasn't risk. Courage is the meaning of life, as Alec Ebert once said, and the old dictum that we are just animals leaves us hopeless. Anyway, the map drive leads us to autonomous rationality, which means the map drive is likely to err against the admonishments of Benjamin Fontaine and the modern counter-enlightenment more generally. But even if we know of this error, without a life that is situated to regularly encounter otherness, a life of encounterology, we might say, this knowledge will not prove enough. In fact, it will easily be weaved and quilted into the internal consistency of our worldview. Knowledge of the truth can make the truth further away. So it goes when we speak of love, and love as openness to the other without a lifestyle that is positioned and situated to be surprised by otherness. This love will easily just prove a means of self-deception. We must be surprised, but how can we plan for surprise? We can't, hence the challenge of spreading childhood in part 2, which ultimately will suggest the need for a new infrastructure, a new social coordination mechanism. If we cannot do this, maps seem to be our final destination, a coping within the problem of internally consistent systems. We need maps to be free. For one, because freedom and navigability are strongly connected, as pointed out by Cass R. Sunston, which is what a map provides. And second, because otherwise the world wouldn't make sense and we would be overwhelmed by the real. Freedom of choice is important, even critical, but it is undermined or even destroyed if life cannot be navigated, either because we don't have a map and or because the real has made life unbearable. We require a choice architecture, an environment in which choices are made, and this can be associated with a map. But if we need maps to navigate the world freely, can we ever be free of maps or some choice architecture? Are maps traps? They are inevitable, but not necessarily totalitarian. They can be connected with Sunstein's nudge, where there is an insistence that people should be free to choose, but at the same time, people are not left defenseless and naked before the real in immense complexity. For whatever freedom was found in this would be overwhelmed by the anxiety of that freedom, from which no freedom would be available. We might say that freedom for Sunstein is a freedom to go, and without a map, all we can do is go to get lost, which doesn't feel like freedom at all, but randomness and unintelligibility, a cheap to lose, perhaps. But then, are we unable to be free from maps? And what if they are traps? A line of flight without a dome. If we are stuck in our maps, it would seem that pluralism is doomed to atomism and to fracture off into countless tribes that are not intelligible to one another. Maps seem necessary for some reason, say as a stage for the beautiful, but they also risk fracturing the world apart into tribes which could end up in World War III. Is there no hope? We can always plead deferred ostension. Beauty with Paul Virilio points to a way, as will be elaborated on in Belonging Again, The Fate of Beauty and Reconstructing A as A, where Virilio teaches us that the substance is equally invention of the accident, and we consider the strike of beauty as a surprising encounter that is only possible thanks to substance, surprising like an accident. With the ship is invented the shipwreck, so with the map is created the break between the map and the territory, otherwise the map would not exist. But how do we break the map and we not be destroyed by the real or overwhelmed by an unintelligible complexity? If we don't break the map, we seem stuck in a self-enclosure AA in which the other cannot fully reach us except as filtered, interpreted by us, and our maps a lower dimensionality. But if we do break our map, we seem doomed. Can we break our maps without breaking it apart? Can we lift it off the territory to see a distinction without tearing the map or having it flutter away? Wittgenstein spoke of repairing spider webs like repairing traditions. Do we speak here of handling webs with our fingers and not breaking them? Isn't that impossible? Nothing lost, nothing gained. If inventing the substance means indirectly inventing the accident, the more powerful and high-performance the invention, the more dramatic the accident, which is to say the more powerful the accident can and even must be, which unveils the break. Mysticism is powerful, beauty is powerful, flow is powerful. Here we might mention the emergence of two currents of thought that are in no way antagonistic but complementary. Substantialism, or if you prefer materialism, and accidentalism, or if you prefer spiritualism. What Virilio identified of the accident is arguably an inverse and or privation of the strike that is found in beauty, a testament of the form we need, latent in every creation, which points to its right ordering and fullness in beauty, which requires surprise and encounter for which we are prepared, so that love is not lovecraft. Let us not forget too much light and you get blindness. Our map drive does not have to be a fate into an enclosure, but it will be, if we don't negate sublated, into a faithful presence, a clearing for beauty and otherness. Section 7. We can speak of the map drive of human action manifest in the C word, but not reducible to the C word, which all human effort must be toward or else risk unintelligibility that exposes us to the real at a rate we cannot handle. Freud theorized that sexuality constantly motivates us, and I would align this with maps, for there is something erotic and sexual about coherence, oneness. Through complex processes of conversation, interaction, theorizing, and more, we strive to define our way of seeing the world, which is also often an act of spreading it toward a unity of all, sexual. Rationality serves this effort, which ironically heads toward self-effacement, a Freudian death drive, precisely in the hope for a total unity. For to delete distinction is to delete the distinction needed for sexual union, and without sexuality, humans lose motivation and perish. Irony is the fabric of reality. What holds us together are ironic efforts we need to exist, but that we can never let reach completeness. Also, total unity is flat and without texture, which we can associate with entropic equilibrium, alluding to Alex Ebert's thinking. In this way, to speak of rationality is to speak of sexuality, and to speak of truth is to speak of the notion of unification, conception, which the rationality is toward, perhaps phallic. Even a truth that claims there is no final unification is nevertheless that which is its rationality is toward as that which ought to be that which everyone ascribes to. Please note that when we love someone or something, we inherently feel we ought to be with the being in some way, even at a distance, for relationships are not reducible to special quantifications. Every rationality must be toward a final conception. The concept in Hegel could be libidinal, approach from being to essence to, and yet this means every rationality is at risk of a Nash equilibria and totalization that causes self-effacement, all thanks to love. Libidinal rationality hence requires non-rationality to save itself, which we can associate with the feminine and the truth, which ends up hysterical without rationality to filter the real. Please note, rationality reflects love, but love is in the image and likeness of Lovecraft. Schrodinger asked Dante, Lovecraft. The map drive has brought us to global pluralism, which we can associate with a great libidinal unity, and now we are suffering the struggles and challenges of marriage. The honeymoon phase, perhaps the 90s through 2008, is over, and we are finding divorce something that shouldn't be off the table, as perhaps represented by Alexander Dugin, for good and for bad. And like a couple on the verge of divorce, though the decision is not yet made or final, there is silence, avoidance, drifting, laughter in the face, but not in the belly, and dinner parties with neighbors. What is not said. Is the pain too deep to heal? It can feel that way, but the deep pain of the nails in God's hands become testaments of glory. There is always a chance for negation, sublation, even in our age of Historia. Since the true isn't the rational, we are not doomed to end up in a suboptimal world. There's hope. But because the true isn't the rational, we can also end up in C-word, fundamentalism, totalization, and madness. Our hope is a risk, the absolute choice. Our problem contains its address, but only if we approach it well, and yet we cannot directly approach it, or else the map would be the territory, which is not the case, for I could be wrong. We must approach our problem in a way that lets it be a surprise, to allude to Thomas Wynne on Heidegger, which is to say we must let the other be other, which must be a surprising encounter, and thus risk of Lovecraft attend. Is that terrifying? Yes, I said yes, I will, yes. Attention is all VII. Rationality seeks to be autonomous, and C-words totalize, meaning they are isomorphic. To think is to risk, but we must think. Furthermore, if reality is a situation, it could be a pitch-in novel. We cannot avoid the problem of notions, maps, because reality itself is situational and relational. To deny this is to risk madness and lose any hope of a science of sanity found in Corbisky. Everything is connected, and that means everything is at risk of ending up in pitch-in. Or beauty? Yes, but that is not given and requires preparation, illic, and risk. Otherwise, the reality situation that everything is connected means that we are radically positioned and primed for C-word, or making some big other out of completeness and rationality. Benjamin Fontaine desires so on. The big other of Lacan suggests everything is held together, that there is something which can quilt the world into sensibility and keep it under control, which can make everything connected, which is also the promise and suggestion of the C-word. If everything is connected, though, why in the world would we connect to live as if reality is essentially incomplete with the I in parentheses? Don't those positions cancel one another out? It would seem that way. But really, the contradiction is Hegelian and a call on us to incorporate in higher dimensionality, which is AB and metageometry of Leibniz, and everything being connected, everything is that which we cannot fully comprehend as an apathetic lack and excess, and hence we experience it as incomplete and must absolutely choose what we believe the qualities are of that incompleteness. Reality is incomplete with the I in parentheses, and we find ourselves with a map drive for completeness, which is fitting because reality is situational, but a drive for completeness is not the same as a drive for recognizing situation. Perhaps the drive for completeness is what the drive to recognize situation becomes when misordered, but in recognizing situation, we can recognize something more apathetic, whereas in seeking completeness, that recognition seems less likely, arranging us for self-effacement. We have suggested that rationality, which doesn't acknowledge its non-rational foundations, prone to end up in C-word-like structures, as we have suggested that rationality, which seeks to totalize itself, ends up in the most suboptimal of possible worlds. Where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us realizing that we face significant challenges because the true isn't the rational, but at the same time there is hope precisely because the true isn't the rational. It means a faithful presence and focus on surprising encounters really might work. The very formation of the map as, like a C-word, means they must risk showing their hand to form and impossibly making the root and structure visible. There is a hope that we might see and understand the structure, which for Hegel is the first step in liberation and freedom. Indeed, if we cannot interpret something well, it is unlikely we will respond well to it either. All right, having glimpsed the C-word structure of maps, and having also realized that autonomous rationality will only lead to totalizing maps, what now? What should be our concern and focus? Ultimately, avoiding self-effacement is only possible if we recognize something beyond ourselves, meaning there is otherness according to which a dialectic is meaningful and possible. And on this point, we can see the need for a rethinking of what constitutes critical thinking. If we do not think otherness, we easily do not think. To purchase The Map is Indestructible, please check out Amazon. All purchases and reviews are deeply appreciated. For the sections of The Map is Indestructible released thus far, please go to Medium and find the list. And you can also find the piece that we have read on Substack. And for a list of the sections, you can look on YouTube. Thank you so much for your time.